The Road to Lisbon, the cEDH European Championship, has been an event that a lot of European players have been playing towards for over a year now. It was an amazing effort by cEDH PT to increase the amount of basically professional play of cEDH in Europe. And I had to absolutely cover it. I know it's been a bit of a minute since this championship was about a week and a half ago by the time you're seeing this video, but this championship was super important. I had to cover it. I know there's a lot of stuff and a lot of amazing tournaments out there right now. I'm definitely going to be going through and covering a lot of them over these next couple weeks, but I had to cover the Road to Lisbon. So many amazing people worked so hard to not only qualify for this tournament, but also to run this tournament. It was a major push from a lot of European cEDH organizers, and it had to be celebrated here on this channel. So let's talk about the top 16 of the Road to Lisbon. While you are here, make sure to hit that like button, the subscribe button helps out the channel a whole ton. And if you check out patreon.com/comedianmtg, you can get some amazing perks like having your name in the description, like the many folks you'll see after this video's conclusion. We're starting off with a sweet one here. We have Jackie the Puppet with this Kenrith list. So a little bit of context before we jump on into this top 16. Because there were so many players at this event, I believe there were in 277, unless I'm mistaken. Yep, exactly, 277. So because of that number, they actually implemented a top 40 cut, which we were seeing a lot in early cEDH with larger tournament sizes. Basically, as soon as you get that around that 200 size, a lot of organizers actually like doing top 40 cuts. And what a top 40 cut basically means is that the top 8 move directly onto the semifinals at the end of Swiss. But then the remaining 32 players play a quarterfinals match, basically a best of one match that qualifies them to be the last 8 people for the semifinals, right? So the top 8 automatically get locked in for the semifinals, whereas the rest of the 32 people, basically 9 through 40, have to fight it out so that they can make it into the semifinals, right? So everyone who you'll see from 16 through 9 not only did pretty well in the Swiss, but also had to win a quarterfinals match to get up to this top 16, right? So definitely a lot to be said about the top 40 system. I'm actually a really huge fan of it. I've enjoyed every tournament that's had a top 40 system. I think it keeps people engaged. It makes, growing to larger scales of numbers not feel like, oh, well, 5 people lost out because the percentage of their breakers was a little bit off, right? It happens like lower down the line, but it feels a little bit less punishing for people who still had amazing records going into these top cuts. So big fan of the top 40 cut. Super happy to see it implemented here in this 277 person tournament. So we have Kenrith here by Jackie the Puppet, and this is a super spicy Kenrith list. And what I really like about this Kenrith deck is when often you're faced with, a lot of these 5-color soup commanders, these generic value commanders, right? The question then becomes, why this commander in particular, right? And I feel like this deck has a lot of very specific answers to that question, where other decks may lack more specificity in that department, right? So we have Kenrith here with some super sweet stuff. We'll go over the win cons and then we'll go into more detail on the rest of the deck. First of all, this is a Hermit Druid deck. And for anyone not familiar with Hermit Druid, Kenrith is probably one of the best Hermit Druid commanders, as there are multiple ways that when Kenrith is on the battlefield, it can actually just clean up the Hermit Druid lines a considerable amount. So Hermit Druid allows you to reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal basic, and then put all the cards revealed this way right into the graveyard, right? The thing with Hermit Druid decks is you never play basics, right? And in a 5-color list like Kenrith, it's really not much of a deck building restriction, as most 4 to 5-color decks don't play basic lands anyways, right? So then you'll see the interesting part of this deck list, which is that there is no dread return. So traditionally, what you often do with Hermit Druid lines is that you mill your entire library and then use a card like Dread Return, which has a flashback cost, meaning you can cast it from the graveyard to reanimate your Thassa's Oracle. Now in this version, Hermit Druid's kind of acting more like a creature demonic consultation, right? You play Hermit Druid, you tap it, and then you play your Thassa's Oracle, right? So you're not playing as many dead cards in the deck, but it definitely makes Hermit Druid a bit less effective. The other thing you can also do is if you have Kenrith on the battlefield, you can always activate Hermit Druid, mill your entire library, and then pay 5 into Kenrith's last ability to put the Thassa's Oracle onto the battlefield. You will have noticed that this is definitely an Underworld Breach deck. Here we have Underworld Breach with Brain Freeze and Lion's Eye Diamond, the ability to storm through your entire library, and then usually use the Oracle at that point. This is a Necropotence deck, even though definitely a bit of a higher curve for a Necro deck. And I think most interestingly about this deck, as you might have already seen in the enchantment section, this is a Doomsday list. So for those who haven't played with Doomsday, it's not always the most popular option. Basically, you exile all but 5 cards from your deck and graveyard, and then you have to find a way to crack the Doomsday pile, meaning to draw a card off the top of it, because it's not like it puts those cards in your hand, they just go back on top of your deck. And usually through that, you find a way to go through the Doomsday pile and usually push something like a Thoracle out. So a Gush is seemingly the best way to do that in a deck like this. Now, it's really interesting, a lot of the win conditions in this deck do rely on Thassa's Oracle, but it is kind of nice that you do have the Bomberman combo in this deck too, which is Auriok Salvagers and Lion's Eye Diamond, able to generate infinite mana. And it is nice that if you lose your Thassa's Oracle through some exiling or whatever it may be, because you have the Bomberman combo in the deck, you don't exactly lose win conditions because you can still assemble Auriok Salvagers and Lion's Eye Diamond after milling your library with Hermit Druid. You can still assemble it after going into a Doomsday line. And basically, what that allows is for you to make infinite mana and then use Kenrith's ability to force your opponents to draw cards infinitely. And the only way they can survive that is with an Angel's Grace, because any other spell they sort of try to force on top of it, you just make them draw cards in response, anyways. So that part's pretty sweet. And then also, you can always just, play Kenrith and draw to you, get a Grand Abolisher, anyways, to, to avoid that possibility as well. But this is a super unique Kenrith list, and definitely not one that you see a whole lot. I mean, we have Oko here mostly as a control piece, being able to shut off people's commanders. We have Sarah Ascendant, which I find rather fascinating as like a grindy control option. Really there, and you don't see this a lot outside of Timna decks, right? Normally, it's definitely a piece to put a little bit of pressure on people's lives while also drawing cards with Timna, or in I guess Sax decks as well. But here it seems to be just sort of a fair hit your opponents, put a little pressure on their life total, gain me some life back for my Doomsday, or for my Necropotence, or for, interestingly enough, we also have a Bolus's Citadel here, which is kind of interesting because like you don't see most of the setup pieces you would traditionally associate with Bolus's Citadel in this deck. Like you do have your Black Rituals, which is nice. But this is like a very land heavy deck, right? It's a 29 land deck. What is nice is that Bolus's Citadel and Doomsday, as well as Sensei's Divining Top, all have really great relationships with one another, right? Like with Bolus's Citadel specifically, if you hit Doomsday, you're able to resolve your Doomsday and then go through your entire Doomsday pile with using Bolus's Citadel to free cast everything in that pile, which is kind of sweet. So there's a lot of really interesting, unique dynamics in this list, and I do find it super fascinating. One thing also to note is that we do have Necro with Born Upon a Wind, but there's not many other flash enablers. So this is a very thin Necropotence package here in this list. There's not even a Final Fortune to go take another turn. So kind of fascinating stuff here for this super unique Kenrith deck. Very cool stuff. We have Mandalora here with I'm just gonna just move over and let you read this entire description because I don't even know what to think. If you want to pause the screen, you can. Moving on. We have a blue farm list here in the cEDH tournament, and it's interesting to see blue farm showed up quite a lot in the road to Lisbon. So where some people are starting to, doubt whether Timna Crom or Timna Thrasios is really the prevalent deck in the format nowadays, here we have blue farm showing up quite a lot in the road to Lisbon and really putting up pretty decent numbers even post ban. From what I can tell from this blue farm list, it is a pretty traditional blue farm option. The deck is choosing to win with traditionally Underworld Breach is often the primary blue farm win con, but we also have Thassa's Oracle and Demonic Consultation as well as the ability to take your opponent's win cons with Mnemonic Betrayal. Now, one thing that's kind of interesting about this blue farm variant is it is a little more proactively inclined, right? We see things like Bergie in here, as well as often, things like Beseech the Mirror and the second wheel effect are usually a little more indicative, as well as Jessica as well, that this is a more proactive blue farm list. I notice a lot of folks in the European meta tend to note that this sort of blue farm style is indicative of a player named Tremnek, who will show up later very often for these tournaments. So it seems to be that style of blue farm seems to do quite well in this European section of the world. So very, very cool stuff here from this blue farm list. We have Necro lines. as a more prominent feature of these more proactive blue farm lists as well, which makes a lot of sense as the Necro lines did get a lot of upgrades in recent months. Apple of Eden is probably the big spice card in this blue farm deck, as it's not traditionally played in a lot of these decks. But if you're expecting your opponents to be playing some more proactive strategies and things like that, the ability to take your opponent's win cons or even just take one of their hands away as you're going for a win is pretty sweet. So, very cool stuff here from this blue farm list. And congrats your pilot for making the top 16. We are shouting out another Kickstarter today. We have the Justina and Piotr Dura playmat collection, which has just reached its goal, but we can still contribute to that. There are an awesome number of playmats that are going to be available, including cEDH All-Stars like Bolus's Citadel, Underworld Breach, Sigarda Fauna Blessings, Kalia, and Talion especially, with some larger goals in the future being some of the Hallowed Fountain Infinity art and a bunch of other really amazing art pieces that are coming down the line. So if you're interested, I'll leave the link for that Kickstarter in the description down below. I'm gonna butcher this. Aeon with TNT. Here we have a classic Timna and Thrasios list here, right? A deck that has definitely picked up a whole ton post Dockside Jeweled Lotus Mana Crypt ban with some interesting stuff here in the 99. This is definitely one of these TNT lists that is leaning a little bit more towards the creature strategies. We have things like Emil and Derevi in the deck, as well as Cloud of Fairies. So with a lot of these cards, so Cloud of Fairies plus Emil or Derevi plus Emil, you are using things like Mycospawn to go put your Gaia's Cradle onto the battlefield, right? So suddenly, when you're able to flicker your Derevi or flicker your Cloud of Fairies over and over again, you're able to generate infinite mana through those traditional creature means. We also have Devoted Druid in here, and surprisingly, no Hazel's Brewmasters, which has been like a huge pickup for most Timna Thrasios lists, and very shocked to not see it in this Timna Thras list. Although I'm assuming Devoted Druid is in here for a reason, and yeah, that reason seems to just be the Swift reconfiguration combo, which is still an amazing 1 mana plus your Devoted Druid instant speed, make infinite green combo, works as Thrasios as an outlet. So that's totally fine. It's just very interesting to see that Hazel's, which has been like a big upgrade for a lot of these Timna Thrasios, or even Thrasios plus any sort of black decks, has been a really significant auto include for a lot of these strategies. So interesting to see it not be an auto include here in this version. We also have Basalt Monolith with Kinnan up here in the creature base, able to be an infinite colorless mana combo, and then obviously channel that into your Thrasios in the command zone. And then the traditional Thassa's Oracle plus Demonic Consultation in this list. Definitely playing some more interesting choices in this deck. Things like Lorien Revealed are definitely not traditional pieces here in Timna Thrasios. And this list is definitely pretty interaction heavy compared to a number of Timna Thrasios, as I've seen. Definitely a lot of free interaction here with these decks, leaning into things like Flare of Denial, stuff like that, which is pretty interesting. Just kind of looking to see if Lorien Revealed has any particular island that it's going for, but I don't really see one in particular. I think it's more just like a generic Lorien Revealed type card, and seeing if they can get away for paying 5 mana for 3 cards. Um, and Shifting Woodland here in the mana base, kind of an interesting inclusion, as well as Town Gates of Madara. Definitely some nice Modern Horizons pickups here for the mana base of this deck. And apart from that, Timna Thrasios is really just trying to be the 4-color mid-range option of the format, right? They are a grindy commander pairing, but at the end of the day, you sort of stick in early advantage engine like a Rhystic Mystic, something like that, and then allow your commanders to also allow some extra value grind and allow you to go over the top of your opponents, sometimes with things like Seaborn Muse or any of the creature combos that we mentioned, stuff like that. So pretty sweet to see this Timna Thrasios deck playing some interesting stuff like Delny in here. Very creature focused TNT deck, which is a bit of a unique take on the archetype. So cool stuff here from our player, and congrats on the top 16. We have Ragnar here with cEDH Blue Farm, and as we have already looked at one Blue Farm list in this tournament, let us compare it to the most recent option. So we have a 15 card difference between our two Blue Farm lists. So both of our players on 27 lands, just choosing a different pairing of lands per each deck. We have some more interaction here with this AJ Eric Bufumo deck list. Things like Pyroblast, Snap, Swords, no Drannith Magistrate in our more recent performing lists, and more rocks in our other list as well, having things like Apple of Eden, Talisman, Grim Monolith, and another Talisman. And no Praetor's Grasp in our more recent list, compared to Reign of Filth, Professional Facebreaker, as I mentioned, just significantly less artifacts and really, not trying to go too hard onto the artifact plan. We have the classic Cavern of Souls blue farm tech, able to give you your uncountable grand abolishers when you need it. You have the Teferi Time Raveler, which is also, another sort of one of the innovations for the more proactive lists that's been played for quite some time by people like Tremnick and other folks over in Europe, which I've always loved in Blue Farm. I thought Teferi has been insane, just being able to be a Grand Abolisher and a removal spell all in one. And then we see a bit more of a red focus in this Blue Farm list so that you can support Flare of Duplication. So having things like Facebreaker and Dragon Race Channeler give you a little bit of that early game value. And a little more proactive with Reign of Filth, helping those Necro lines and Nas lines and stuff like that. And especially given the fact that, this list is very light on artifacts, I can imagine Reign of Filth becomes a bit more relevant when working with things like Mox Opal and all that kind of stuff. So pretty sweet differences here in our blue farm lists. And apart from that, I mean, just a little bit of difference in interaction, right? For the snap, there's a snap back. For the swords, it's a flood mon. For the pyroblast, it's an offer you can't refuse, right? So a lot of cards filling in the same type of slots, just different innovations by different pilots. So congrats to Ragnar on making it in with this blue farm deck. We have Black Bolt here with mono red Ragavan, which is definitively not a mono red Ragavan list. This is Thrasios and Timna. We have another Thrasios and Timna list here, and you know what that means. It's comparison time, but we already see one major difference, which is this list is playing the Hazel's Brewmasters. So we've got about 20 cards different between our Thrasios and Timna lists here, where we have things like Mycospawn to get our Cradle. There's no Demonic Consultation in our more recent TNT list. There's no Spellseeker, no Lorien Revealed. A bunch of the cards I've actually called out in the other list, especially some of the interesting choices with the mana base we don't see in our list. And notably, a TNT list without Force of Negation, which is kind of wild, seeing as TNT is often very much definitively grindy, mid-rangey. And so to not have it play one of its best free interaction pieces is pretty interesting. And so in this deck, we have Swan Song, which I was actually kind of surprised to see the other list not on. And definitely missed that with my first review. Swan Song is definitely one of those pieces that I consider just sort of an auto include in the format at this point. And we have a lot more combos with Devoted Druid in this version. This version has Hazel's Brewmasters, which once again, Devoted Druid in the graveyard makes it a food, make infinite green, or Machine God's Effigy, which then makes a artifact version of a Devoted Druid, makes infinite green that way. So very, very Machine Gods and Hazel Brewmasters and Devoted Druid heavy version of this TNT list. And it seems like they gave up a little bit of interaction and things like Force of Negation and Flare in favor of more just value grind engines, right? A lot more things like your Bloom Tenders and your Fabro Elders, able to get you a bunch of Thrasios activations, more Polywog Prodigies for more card draw, and Light and Tutor that grabs most of your value engines. You have Survival of the Fittest, which is not only a value engine but also able to one card combo assemble the Hazel Brewmaster combo by putting in your Devoted Druid in the yard and then grabbing Brewmasters. So there's definitely a lot of interesting stuff here with this TNT variant, and definitely a pretty interesting sidestep from the one we looked at earlier. Definitely unique in their own ways, and some choices I like from both lists, and then some choices I think I would prefer from the others. So very interesting combination of swaps here with these TNT lists. And I'm curious in our more recent list if they were running more. No, both of them on 27 lands, which is definitely like it's low for these decks, but I also like I think it's becoming pretty standard. I just feel like I've seen a lot of TNT players get stuck on that second and third land, especially when they're playing on not a ton of these very significant non-basics. But it's also very interesting to see that the similarities between these two decks as well, right? A lot of these Cloud of Fairies and Derevi variants with the Emil combos have been sort of not doing well over in the US. And so seeing that these more Derevi Emil focused TNT decks making their way all the way to the top tables of these tournaments is pretty interesting. And I'm wondering if that came up as giving these pilots a leg up in these tournaments. We have Yidris Maelstrom Wielder here, a sweet 4-color storm deck, and definitely a super unique list to see up here in this top 16. Now, what you're going to see from this Yidris deck, and what we've sort of always traditionally seen from Yidris, is that it takes advantage of having green by being able to play a lot of the 1-mana dorks, right? They sort of help to allow you to set up that turn 3 storm really well, right? Giving you your turn 2 Burgies and stuff like that, your turn 2 advantage engines like Ristic Study, and even 6 in this variant, which is pretty sweet. And then the rest of the deck is just the classic Grixis Turbo Nas shell just supported really well with a bunch of different green options, right? So I'm actually super surprised to see Sylvan Library in a deck like this, as this list pays life quite a lot, right? We have no Bolsa Citadel here, which is, I think, often associated with the traditional Yidris list, but this is definitely much more in the traditional four color Turbo Nas spectrum of play. We have things like Frantic Search, you have Manamorphose, a classic storm option here. We even have Daze to protect those early aggressive wins. And a lot of rituals here, as you can see throughout this deck. Some of the more traditional cantrips, things like Brainstorm, which makes sense in a deck like Idris, as you really want to get a lot of those early storms out from this deck. And just the full four wheel package, right? Like, this is traditional storm as classic as it can come. And yeah, sometimes you really need to just push these wheels as hard as possible, right? So it makes a ton of sense here with this Yidris deck. Pretty sweet stuff here from this very non-traditional storm option. You have things like Wheel of Fate, which can be cascaded down to from all of your zeros, which obviously gives you a pretty cool fifth wheel in this deck. As a bowmaster, there's no other ways to take care, or take advantage, I should say, of all the wheels in the deck, but a lot of very proactive play here. We have Flood Caller, and I believe this also had Born Upon the Wind in this deck as well. So they're definitely able to try and execute wins at instant speed with this deck. I'm very curious to hear if anyone knows the pilot, to hear if they're more of a Necropotence deck in this list, or much more of an Adnaz style, or even just a traditional go for Yidris, or whether it really is super flexible depending on the environment, which would make a lot of sense too. Definitely interesting to see things like Ripples of Undeath and Sylvan Library as these like sort of slower card advantage engines in this Yidris deck, which I think, most people would shy away from, but that might mean that these pieces are actually probably decent for giving you consistency, where a lot of other Turbo Nas decks would sort of fall upon themselves. So cool to see this Yidris deck having a little bit of flexibility, some unique options. Crazy enough to see a Mox Opal deck on 9 artifacts in total, but I mean, it makes sense for the archetype, right? When you're storming off, when you're trying to win instant speed, you do need your Mox Opals, right? But it's just wild to see the post Mana Crypt ban reality that some of these storm decks are in. And yeah, 9 artifacts, trying to lock in the Metalcraft with a third of the artifacts in your deck is pretty tough margins to work around. But seems like they're able to make it work. So congrats to our pilot for bringing the absolute spice. And I'm pretty sure Satira is a name I've seen working on Yidris for a really, really long time. And I used to look at their deck for inspiration way back in the day, like 2 years ago when I was working on this archetype. So congrats on loving an archetype, working very hard on it, and showing up and performing for a deck that most people I think would sort of scoff at or laugh out of the room, right? But like, here we have Yidris at the top 16 of like the grandest tournament in Europe, showing up and locking in those numbers. So congrats. You know them, you love them. ToaMagic.com to get your cEDH singles. If you're going to events near you, some major Magic events or things like SCG, stuff like that, ToaMagic.com will most likely have a booth, so you can order things online and pick them up at location. Check out ToaMagic.com. Use code Comedian for 5% off your order. We got another Blue Farm list here. We know the usual at this point. Hey, let's do a little comparison feature. So compared to our more recent Blue Farm option here, where our other list was going a lot heavier on the red, things like Wheel of Fortune, Jessica's Will, Flare, Dragon Rage, and Bergie, and the Windfall and One Ring combination. So a few less wheel/grind pieces and a lot less red. Actually, no wheels in comparison to our previous list, and no Rain of Felt, no Snapback. In this list, we have our Grim list. So this one's back on the Mana Rocks, choosing to have a little bit more consistency on the Mana Rock packages, and then a little creature heavy, right? So things like Polywog, Ledger Shredder. If you notice, Facebreaker is not in the exclusion, so this is definitely a very Timna Facebreaker esque Blue Farm list looking here, right? So things like Mastermind, Oppo, Shredder, a lot more of these 2 mana advantage engines in here, able to get some card advantage, grind with Timna, et cetera, et cetera. So pretty solid option here. And then Deluge, which is funny because we're talking about how much heavier on creatures this version is, but this is like what happens when you get to the mid-rangier versions of Blue Farm. A lot of time they need something to sort of clean up the creature decks if things are getting a little too frisky. So pretty sweet option here from this Blue Farm pilot. And there's another one. And our next deck is also a blue farm list, but this one's running some pretty unique pieces, which I think is pretty sweet. So where you're seeing a lot of our more explosive engines out of our other blue farm lists, and ad nauseum, which most people associate with the blue farm style Timnacrom strategy. Our current list is doing some pretty different stuff. This is an ad nauseum list, but including Necropotence, much more mid-range control version of Blue Farm. We've got board wipes like Blasphemous Act and Amphibian Downpour, which is another card I think I've mentioned on this channel, is definitely rising in my stocks. Some grind pieces like Deep Dome Terramancer, able to get you some extra land drops. And if we're noticing here, one, two, three, um, versus one. So definitely up to, I think, 29 lands in this version. Yeah, much more land heavy, more consistent mid-rangey blue farm list, right? A lot less rituals, a lot less rapid acceleration, more clones, which I think is, if you're going to go into the creature heavy version, makes a lot of sense, right? You expect the game to go a bit longer. You want to be able to get copies of whatever the best, the Seedborn uses or the Nezahals out of the Kinnons or anything like that, right? So Fimage making a little bit of sense here, as well as Phyrexian Metamorph for those purposes. This one's on Containment Priest, saying no thank you to any of the green decks or any of the breach decks trying to flashback creatures, right? Very, very stacksy piece here. Where we're seeing a Stifle, which is not a traditionally heavily played card here in cEDH, but it's one of those cards that when it gets you, it feels so truly awful. But yeah, definitely much more classically mid-range blue farm variant here. It's a lot of the times that we do hear a lot of blue farm pilots going like, yeah, we don't even really win with ad nause that often. And this pilot saying, yeah, so why play it, right? I get to play my one mana board wipe instead and get to enjoy a bit of a higher CMC curve without worrying about what that means for my ad nause implications. So very cool to see this nauseless blue farm here all the way up in the top 16. Croxy here with Esper Breach. Very cool. Very cool CEDH list. It says -1 Hedron Crab, +1 Psychic Frog as update. So I'm assuming that is a reference to the changes made post championship. No, they haven't had any changes in 15 days, so I think that is the tournament day of. So we have a Master of Keys list here, which is sweet because Master of Keys has been one of those decks that a lot of people have been talking about, and yet we haven't really seen a ton of results from it. So it is an X for Esper outlet. It's a flyer. And it says when it enters, you put X counters on it and mill twice X cards. Each enchantment card in your graveyard has escape, and its normal mana value plus 3 cards, right? So Master of Keys here is sort of a deck that has struggled for definition, right? Some people play it as, oh, well, you just play Esper mid-range value and then use Master of Keys as an infinite mana outlet. Some people play it as, oh no, you want to loop enchantments as often as possible, right? There's a lot of different variants here, and I think by checking out the enchantments, we can really learn a lot about what this variant is doing. One thing I'm learning right away is that this is definitively a reanimator variant, right? We have things like Animate Dead, Dance of the Dead, and Necromancy here. Tiny Bones joins up, usually associated with a lot of enchantment reanimator lines. I know specifically Master of Keys gives you an intuition line where you can go with Abdel Adrian, which is one of your reanimator win cons. For those who don't know, it's basically the white World Gorger Dragon where you can start flickering all of your non-land permanents over and over again, right? So with intuition, you can set up Abdel Adrian, you can set up Tiny Bones joins up, and you can set up one of your reanimating enchantments. If they give you any of the combinations, you can set up your combo, right? If they give you Abdel, you might be worried, oh no, Abdel's stuck in my hand, but you can actually then just escape your Tiny Bones joins up, target yourself for the discard mode as well as your opponents because it's free to do so, and put your Abdel into your graveyard. Then you can escape your Reanimator targeting Abdel, and any permutation from that point just gets better for you, generally speaking. This is an Auriok Salvager's Bomberman combo, as I mentioned, so able to use Master of Keys as an outlet there. Now, I have seen some of these lists that do the Abdel Adrian stuff not use Thassa's Oracle as a win condition, but I do like seeing it here with Thassa's Oracle, Thematic Consultation, and Tainted Pact as the backup lines because you don't want to basically not have a win condition if the graveyards get shut off, which Thassa's Oracle allows you to have a backup plan if that's the case. And I believe, okay, so this is the reference. So they added a Psychic Frog and took out this Hedron Crab. after the championship, which I'm assuming means the Hedron Crab is one of the more lackluster options that they were exploring. And I do like Psychic Frog and Reanimator decks. It actually, because the ability to discard a card at any time, it allows you to just like pitch a reanimation target and then also just gain value for, Psychic Frog stuff. We have Doom Whisper here as a value reanimate target, which is definitely not the value reanimate I'm used to seeing. Usually it's something like a Razaketh or a Hoarding Broodlord or a Consecrated Sphinx, but Doom Whisper here makes sense when your commander cares very heavily about the graveyard. So really cool. I'm just kind of geeked because Master of Keys has been one of those cards that I've worked a lot with folks on, and I've seen a lot of exploration on it. And there really hasn't been many pilots who've been able to convert a lot of that exploration into top results. And here we have, the largest European tournament for traditional CEDH, and it's doing well, right? And it did very, very well in this event. So it's really, really cool to see here that this Master of Keys list did fantastically. So congrats to the pilot for putting up a solid result here with this Master of Keys list. Very, very sweet performance. And yeah, sick deck. I'm like super into this archetype. A lot of cool stuff to explore here, and I highly encourage folks to come check it out and see a lot of the very like interesting and responsible decisions, I'd even argue, from the pilot here that sort of give this deck the nuance that allowed it to succeed. We have our first Kinnan here with Slash Rose Kinnan Monolith with some cool stuff already featured. We have Narset, I believe Parter of Veils is the version. Yeah, Parter of Veils, saying, hey, if you think this is a Rhystic Study Mystic Remora meta, what if my opponents weren't allowed to draw more than one card every turn? And that makes my job a lot easier. This is a really unique Kinnan list, and I've got to check the lands because this very much reminds me of the 20. Okay, so this is a 30 land Kinnan deck, which is, I've been telling a lot of Kinnans to go crazy and go up to 28 lands. So the fact that we're on 30 lands in Kinnan is wildly irresponsible as far as ensuring land drops. And this Kinnan list is running some pretty crazy stuff. Some definitely unique cards that I never see in Kinnan, right? We have things like Walking Ballista here as an infinite mana outlet. Which traditionally isn't really played a lot in Kinnan, as you don't really need to, because usually you can go with the crop rotation lines, but there's no crop rotation in this version, which does sort of make sense as to why that is not an option being chosen by the pilot. And then we have a lot of mana dorks here that allow for freed from the real combos for Kinnan, which, as you saw as we went down here to the enchantment section, this is a freed from the real and Pemin's Aura version of Kinnan. With that being the case, I am vastly surprised that there is no Enduring Vitality in this list, because Enduring Vitality is, like, in my opinion, the thing that made those lines more viable than they've ever been. And it's just not featured here at all. And instead, we're having some of these, kind of quirkier little advantage pieces here, like Gyre Sage and stuff like that, or Gyre Engineer, pardon me, and, which is definitely a little bit scary in a Bowmasters metagame here. But this is an interesting deck. I mean, also to mention the fact that there's a Thassa's Oracle, right? So this Kinnan list is sort of like chock loaded with win conditions in a way where I don't think you necessarily need to be. Also in Jin-Gataxia's Progress Tyrant, which is a piece not a lot of folks are on in Kinnan nowadays, so kind of unique to see it here, especially combined with a number of these sort of quirkier mana dorks and wheels, which are just not normally associated with the Kinnan archetype, especially. And you also notice a lower artifact count, right? Like most Kinnan lists on average are often like 20 artifact Kinnan decks. But this one definitely eschewing a lot of the more traditional pieces here in this Kinnan list, and taking a pretty unique angle on the deck, which I'm assuming definitely led to their success, right? Like you're taking a lot of the things that are sort of assumed in these traditional Kinnan lists, and sort of flipping them on their head and playing, even pieces like Yavimaya Hollow, right? Just the ability to regenerate creatures if they would take lethal damage. So congrats to our pilot on definitely a super unique Kinnan list. I mean, the fact that there's a power artifact in here is definitely a piece that I know would catch many a folk by surprise in this Kinnan option, playing things like Crossing Grip, Peace Within, and traditional counterspell. This is definitely a take on Kinnan that is not like many others that have previously existed, and clearly paid off as they were able to make the top cut of this CEDH tournament. Very cool to see Dihada up here by Johnny Higgy. Dihada is a deck that I think a lot of people assume post ban was just not a thing, and here we have it making the not only a top 16 but the top 8 cut, meaning it had to have one of the best Swiss records for this CEDH tournament. This is a super wild turbo Dihada list that, yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, Dihada is just not a deck many people are talking about. For those who don't know, Dihada as a commander is sort of an Underworld Breach combo. As Underworld Breach, your commander and either Heart of Kirin or the sorcery known as Flicker allow you to make a very interesting ad nauseum or breach line where you're going up one card as well as 2 mana every time you go through the loop. So it makes some really interesting stuff here for this breach line. And it's definitely really sweet to see this list, as I mentioned, was sort of written off, make a top cut here in this tournament. You have pieces like Magda that if you get just one additional treasure, allow you to go use your commander, down ticket, and then immediately tutor something like a Bolus's Citadel onto the battlefield, which pretty sweet being able to cheat that out rather quickly in the game. You also have the grinding station breach lines if you're not using your commander for those. There's a lot of things in this deck that say like I'm going to win now, right? So things like defense grid. You have Grand Abolisher. You also have Myrel, which is just another white Grand Abolisher style effect. So a lot of different proactive ways to say my opponents are not allowed to interact during my turn. You also have the Welder Engineer lines, things that, once again, more cheating of Bolus's Citadel. It's a classic Turbo Nas deck as well. You've got Luris here just to get a lot of your value creatures back, things like Bowmasters, Magda, etc. You have Dualcaster Twin Flame or specifically Dualcaster Molten Duplication in this deck to be able to go infinite there as well. There's also, you know, you can flicker Dualcaster infinitely, but I don't think you have any things that actually turn that into lethal. But it's something cute that you can do. um, you Mayhem Devil in here to also start converting some of these breach lines to more lethal capacities, which is also why you almost always see a Praetor's Grasp in this deck as well, because turning basically mill my entire graveyard with breach style things into a win definitely takes some particular conversions. And there's some really unique stuff here in this Dihada deck, very artifact heavy, which I think you really need for an archetype like this, because to make up for the fact that you don't have Dockside or Crypt or any of those things, you need to be able to basically make your Dihada mana, which isn't always the most easy to cast. And it's super cool to see Dihada up here. I mean, this is a deck a lot of people had written off even before the ban, and then especially after the ban. So sweet stuff here from our pilot, John Hygie, and very sweet job on bringing a very overlooked deck into this top 16. We have Furlough here with another one of these very long description blue farm decks. I don't know what this why there's a whole thing about Kronk. Sure, here's the thing. I'll let you read it. This is a Rogsai deck here, and our first Rogsai of this top cut, having our best Swiss record, but not making it into the top four. We have a pretty traditional Rogsai list here, except for with a few notable changes. First of all, 25 lands. That's more than some Rogsais out there right now. I've seen even 22, 23, even post ban. So that's pretty, aggressive. And I'm glad to see a few more lands in this Rogsai base. We have Apple of Eden, which has been a tech piece in some Rockside builds, but definitely not religiously accepted overall. Definitely a little bit of a slimmer artifact package here. No Bolus's Citadel, things like that. We have the double Necro lines as per usual. Rockside traditionally breach deck, very turbo, quickest deck in the format. And one thing I do like to see here in this list is that they're using, personally, my favorite Grixis line, which is Stitcher Supplier and Culling the Weak, which I think is actually a really sweet Grixis breach option. Although, are they playing Grinding Station on top of this line as well? So they're choosing to not play Grinding Station in favor of the Culling the Weak and Stitcher Supplier line, which basically with breach allows you to go up 2 black mana and sculpt the same amount of cards, right? So you're not going up any cards in the graveyard, but you are filtering which cards are in your graveyard. A little surprised to not see this and the grinding station line, but it seems like a very particular choice. This line in particular also is able to net 2 black mana every time. So notably, it's a breach line that can go through Heuristic Study very efficiently, which is definitely a big upside for a combo like this, right? We've got Thoracle Lines, you got Valley Flood Caller to go off of the Necros, you got Born Upon the Wind to do the very same thing, and it's a speed. A lot of the classic free interaction that Rogsai is known for, right? If you're trying to be the fastest deck in the format, makes sense to have all the free interaction. Got the 4-wheel package that is not most commonly known post ban, because a lot of folks are saying post Mana Crypt the wheels got worse, but some people are still very much pro ban. but some folks are still very pro wheel. So it's a bit of a controversial decision here with this archetype. But Roxai able to make the fifth place of this CEDH top cut. And congrats to our pilot for the top cut. You know we gotta shout out partners of the show, Heavy Play. Get 10% off with code Comedian right now. Plus, there is a major Black Friday sale going on. So whatever you spend, you will be getting an appropriate amount off. So the more you spend over at Heavy Play during Black Friday, the more you get off your order. And you can use code Comedian. So please go check them out. Heavyplay.com. They have an amazing array of products. It is what I personally use to protect my deck boxes. It's what I use for playmats. I believe they still have the new magnetic playmats with the art featured on them on the site right now. So go check it out, heavyplay.com, to get your exclusive products right now. Before we go on to our top four, I want to remind you we do coaching here on Comedian MTG. So if you are interested in seeing your name up here, as we will see in very short supply by one of our pilots in this top four, check out comedianmtg@gmail.com. It's the easiest way to contact me. We're also going to be looking to do some Black Friday sales as well as some holiday sales moving into the new year, which will be pretty fun. Trying to get folks being able to basically use this as a gifting opportunity. So if you're interested in any of that, reach out to me at comedianmtg@gmail.com or any of the other ways that you see in the description down below. So we have a Timna Thrasios here in our top four, Karadirk 23 here with Green Farm. Let's compare it to our other top Timna Thras deck. Using the Moxfield comparison feature here, we can see that we have 17 cards different between our lists here. But notably, once again, this is another Derevi Emil Cloud of Fairies Timna Thrasios list. So it really seems like the European meta has locked in on these TNT variants that are using this option. And also another one not playing the Hazel Brewmasters combo, which is so wild to me because it is so popular here in the US. But we're seeing also no Kin and Basal Monolith, which I do know is one of the more controversial TNT inclusions. But yeah, definitely less combos in this version in favor of more of these Emil Derevi Cloud of Fairies Cradle lines. And having more pieces to support it in this version, like Sowing Mycospawn, Aether Vial, the well contested option here in CEDH, and a list or a card that is definitely, some people are so high on this card, some people are so low on it, but definitely has situations where being able to play your uncounterable Grand Abolisher by tapping your Aether Vial, it comes up, and there are certain aspects of this card that do really allow for when you get it in the early game for it to convert very, very well for your deck. I got a little bit more acceleration, a little bit more proactivity here. Things like Teferi, definitely recognize that. And Birthing Pod here to sort of give you some nice Birthing Pod lines, because Birthing Pod does sort of work as a two-card combo with your commanders, because you're able to Birthing Pod your Thrasios into Derevi, which will then untap the pod, which will then birth the Timna into the Emil, right? And yeah, you do need both your commanders out for that setup, but it's definitely not the most crazy setup in the world. And so Birthing Pod does sort of act as like a quasi one card combo with your commanders, which is kind of cute. We have Consultation back into this list, and definitely double Drake heavy. So this list trying to say, hey, look, you're going to be playing a lot of Avenged Engines in this format. I would like them to be on my side instead, which is pretty sweet here. And then Green Sun Zenith here for a little bit more of that early game acceleration, more of your dorks, more of your, things like Seaborn Muse out earlier in the game. So sweet stuff here from our top four TNT list. We have Espen here with cEDH Turbo King, and I'm super happy to talk about this list because Espen is someone I've been working with for a really, really long time. And I tweeted out as soon as I found out that he was in the finals, and he was very nice to give me a shout out on his interview with Mental Misplay. Espen is a Kenrith player through and through, someone who's been really known for playing this deck for quite a long time. And we talked a lot about this list post ban. This list at one point was a reanimator deck and stuff like that. And then on one of our more recent gameplay sessions, we were talking, and they mentioned or I had mentioned to them like, hey, you're definitely feeling like you're having a lot of these like decision trees that you're not comfortable with this reanimator variant. Why don't we just look back towards the Nas version? And according to all reports, the deck was awesome until basically the finals. um, but very sweet stuff here from this Kenrith Turbo list. So for those who don't know, this Kenrith list is going to be much more akin to some of your more classic 5-color mid-range decks, where like it's a Turbo Nas deck, not even Turbo Nas, but it is a mid range ad nauseum deck, and it's definitely a breach heavy deck. Espen on City of Solitude, because this is the only Grand Abolisher effect that also shuts off channel abilities. So no Talon Gates, no Otawara, no Beseju, anything like that. City of Solitude says we're locking it in. This is what's going to happen during this turn. If this thing resolves, the game's over, right? So no sort of cornucopia shenanigans there with that card. We have a 14 artifact package here, including Vexing Bauble. Kenrith doesn't really get to come down and turn on your guardianships and stuff like that early. So the idea was, hey, let's just shut off the free interaction as much as we can. It's also not a deck that really gets easy Force of Negation access to, right? So yeah, you shut off your own Force of Will and your Pact, but there's a lot of other stuff you're shutting off from your opponents as well. You have Culling Ritual and your wheels here, right? A lot of the supplementary proactive package here, trying to supplement the aggressive plan. And then the pivot plan, where you used to be able to rely on Dockside and Emil in this archetype, is actually with Chatterfang and Warren Soul Trader in this deck. So the idea here is that with Kenrith, with Chatterfang, Warren Soul Trader, as long as there's one creature in addition to those two to sacrifice, you're able to make treasures equal to your life total, right? Because as you make a treasure, you make a squirrel, and you're able to sack it to make a treasure and lose a life for that loop, right? So as you're going through that with Kenrith, Kenrith is able to convert 3 mana into 5 life. So basically, you pay enough life to get Kenrith onto the battlefield, and then you start generating infinite treasures by putting basically 5 mana worth of treasures out there, but only using 3 of it to get your 5 life back. So Kenrith basically converts that combo into a win, sort of no holds bars, and it's pretty sweet. So it's nice to still have the, like, basically, once again, that reason we asked earlier, why are you playing Kenrith? Well, Kenrith is the only one that can turn this 2-card creature combo into a pivot in the late game, and it's 2 slots, right? The rest of the deck can be this more, 5-color good stuff, flexible, proactive option, right? While then the ability to go like, oh, hey, there's a bunch of non-creature or graveyard hate or anything like that out. Cool, let's just execute this 2-card creature combo and win the game. Pretty sweet stuff here from this list. We have Teferi here basically as a removal spell tied to a Grand Abolisher. So a lot of effects in this deck saying like, hey, when I want to go to win, I'm going to win. And then notable observers will notice Zur in the deck. Zur in this list is just value Zur, right? Like, it is either A, you're getting an uncounterable Ristic Study. As I mentioned, there's a City of Solitude in the deck. So, it's one of those things where you can go to combat and go, cool, here's my uncounterable Grand Abolisher effect, your channel abilities, all those things, they're done, right? But also, if you already have your thing that says, hey, I'm going to resolve this spell, sometimes it's just, hey, here's my attack, put a breach under the field. And it's as simple as that. So Zur, definitely a sweet tech piece that Espen came up with, and definitely has some pretty sweet implications. I mean, Zur is already sort of a kill on sight type of card, so folks better kill it on sight, or else it probably leads to a victory here. But it's a pretty sweet 5-color option. You've got a lot of really sweet one of tech pieces in here. But I'm just super happy to see Espen up here. Has been someone I've been working with for a really long time, and is someone I've already known as like a very good pilot. And definitely super happy that we were able to sort of get to a list that he was happy with right before this tournament, and clearly paid off in a very, very awesome way. So congrats to Espen. Your list is sick, and super sweet to see you up here in this top cut of this tournament. And we're back with our number 2 deck here, Kinnan Temple by Azaghal Nyah. Once again, pardon me if I don't get these names quite right, but this is much more of a classic Kinnan Tempo deck. And how would we possibly compare Kinnan? Well, maybe using the Moxfield comparison tool that we've been using all day. I'm actually curious about Kinnan's place in the metagame in this tournament. Okay, so we definitely have it's just 4 top cuts out of 23 participation, so it's only about 17% conversion rate. But I do find it interesting that the conversion rate of the decks that did well with Kinnan were doing well in the top tables, much like we've seen sort of throughout time. So like Kinnan's not doing great as a base level for the deck, but I mean, only 4% under Blue Farm, which we saw had a great performance, and a little bit lower under the Tuna Thrasios is here, but still able to put up multiple top results here. So comparing our 2nd place list to our 7th place list, there are, as I figured, a considerable amount of differences, but yeah, 39 differences between these 2 decks, which I do really think goes to show you how different the 7th place Kinnan list was, and maybe not necessarily how much different these other 2 are, because a lot of the pieces that are in this particular version are the ones we already sort of called out as being unique and interesting. in this other Kinnan list, right? So what we're seeing definitely is like a lot of this specific version we looked at earlier had a significant number of deviations. I've mentioned a lot of these dorks that work with Paradise Mantle and Kinnan specifically, like a lot of that stuff here, things like Eternal Witness, Carpet of Flowers. Um, all of which leading to a rather non-traditional Kinnan experience here with this deck, and honestly many many more than I think I could even cover in this video in particular. Whereas, you know, with this other list up here, we're seeing a lot more of these stuff we know and love from Kinnan, right? Like things like Metamorph, the classic crop rotation packages in the deck. I mean, it being on Gemstone Caverns, Colossal Sky Turtle, right? Like it seems like there was definitely a pretty sizable deviation from standard Kinnan practices for our other lists, things like Enduring Vitality, Tidespout, Wandering Archaic, right? Whereas this second place Kinnan list looks rather traditional in a sense, as maybe Clever Impersonator being one of the spice cards, but even then, it's a spice card that a lot of people are testing out nowadays in modern Kinnan lists. I will say this is a 27 land Kinnan deck, which is, as longtime watchers of the show will know, I'm a big 28 land Kinnan guy right now because of how consistent it is in the metagame. Fairy Mastermind, definitely a solid choice for Kinnan right now, one that I'm not currently on, but definitely one that I respect a lot, and I've seen it do a lot in this current metagame, especially because things are getting very grindy. Fairy Mastermind does better in that environment by a considerable amount here as well. So definitely, as I mentioned, some significant deviations for our earlier Kinnan list, and this one looking a lot more towards the traditional list. Kinnan is a very powerful commander and plays a lot of very, very strong effects. So seeing it appear at these top tables, not a surprise. But congrats to our pilot for taking down second place at this huge European cEDH tournament. And our winner, we have Tremnek on Blue Farm. Tremnek is a very well-known European cEDH player, known for mostly playing this Blue Farm list as well as his pet deck, Tatiova. Tremnek has been a player who's been around for a long time. You'll recognize his name from way back in the Mox Masters events. Been playing Blue Farm significantly as one of his major decks, but someone who has qualified for many events, did quite well. And I'm not surprised to see up here at the top tables of this tournament, a very, very prolific Blue Farm player here at the top cut of this event. And of course, how would we check out this Blue Farm list without comparing it to the others? You will also, before we go into that comparison, notice that Tremnek's list is a primer list. He has a very extensive primer that is one of the ones featured on the decklist database right now. Very well written primer that goes into a lot of the intricacies of this deck. So we have 21 cards different from our list earlier. Now, our most recent list was the Nas list Blue Farm list, which makes sense as we're going to definitely have about 20 cards different here. And a lot of them are the ones we've already sort of called out from the earlier versions of this deck, right? So things like Facebreaker and Dragon Rays Channeler and the Flare of Duplication, right? It's actually extremely similar to the list we saw earlier today. And I'm actually more curious about how it compares to that other very proactive T&K list. So I've compared Tremnek's list actually to our 13th place list, the one that we covered earlier, and they are identical. So it seems that our 13th place player has used Tremnek's stock list. And so this is a list we have already sort of talked about in one way or another. But yeah, very interesting stuff here out of Tremnek's list. As I mentioned, definitely a very well-known Blue Farm pilot and a well-known player around the European scene, known for being very successful with this list. And I mentioned his Tatiova list. So not surprised to see him doing very well here in this tournament and to take this list that, as I mentioned, people are building off of and to have success with it. So congrats to Tremnek on performing well with this deck. Congrats to cEDH PT for hosting an amazing 277 person tournament. I was sad that I couldn't get things together enough personally to go out to this, but it's amazing to see so many players from all across Europe qualify for this event. It's put in a lot of hard work. It's not only just 277 players who signed up, but 277 players who, you know, qualified for one event or another to get into this, and who basically worked all year to hustle and qualify and do well at this really sweet tournament. So congrats to the organizers, congrats to Tremnek, congrats to everyone in the top 4, the top 16, even the top 40. It's really sweet to see all these amazing decks. It's really cool to get some highlights on the European scene right now and to see all of their hard work paying off. So thank you all for watching this video. I hope you liked it. If you like videos like this, make sure to hit that like button and that subscribe button, and I will catch y'all next time. Have a great one. Peace.